the most pressing issues of adolescence for those girls. So if their sport program is not geared towards that social outcome, it's really nice if they run around with a bunch of boys, but that's not going to make the social change. So I guess knowing what good looks like, that beyond 50% participation, girl-centric design, qualified female coaches, infrastructure equality, and we see this in the U.S. all the time, right? Oh, we're compliant with Title IX, or we have good gender equity. Look, we have 8 girls teams and 8 boys teams for sport. Well, what time do the girls practice, and what field are they playing on, and who gets the lights? That's infrastructure equality. It's a big issue in sport, and I think a lot of countries in the world, most countries, are still not up to par in terms of equality on that one. Women in positions of the highest decision making. So if you look at women at the board level positions across sport organizations, whether they're doing social change related stuff or just the growth of sport, there's still a massive underrepresentation. Gender desegregated data. So if you look at how are you measuring your results, are you looking at the differences you see for boys and for girls, or are you just looking at everyone in a conglomerate? So knowing what good looks like, I think, is really important to encouraging progress, because you have to know what progress looks like. And so the next piece, I think, is, just meeting people and organizations where they are. So not everyone is going to be this amazing organization moving the goalposts that I talked about earlier. They've been doing, for 15 years, they've been doing amazing work on gender and girls' rights in sport. But every organization can make progress. So we try really hard not to be what we call the gender police. So going into a country and saying, this isn't working, this is bad, look, you have all male coaches, look, you don't have that, infrastructure equality, but saying, okay, so here's where you are today. So we look at, -3 to +3. Maybe you're at a -2, but can you help get to, what would it look like to get to a -1 or to get to a 0? And so really trying to meet organizations where they are to help them progress, I think, is key, and not coming at the work from a righteous standpoint. Every organization can improve in some way. And then the third thing that we do is to reward this excellence is attention. So publicly acknowledging not just the excellent work, but the bravery it takes to be a disruptor in what's still a very male-dominated environment of sport, and really helping position these different organizations and individuals who have had that bravery in positions of leadership relative to others in our industry or, nationally or on a global stage, I think is really important and can't be understated. There's a story of one organization that we've worked with for a long time called the NAS Foundation in India. And they use netball, which is kind of like a British version of basketball, to work with girls in India, a place where there's 1.3 billion people living, and most of them living in poverty. And they use netball as a way to empower adolescent girls. And they had a young woman who was a young coach named Pallavi Gaikwad. And Pallavi was just one of those superstar coach leaders. She was probably, when I met her, I think she was like around 20, 21 years old, and all the young girls looked up to her, and she really had a strong voice and a presence, and she held her body just really differently. And so we were so impressed with Pallavi, and she went through one of our leadership camps that we used to do in the Netherlands as part of a UK funding project. And we got an invitation to speak, Women Win did, at the Clinton Global Initiative. So Bill and Hillary Clinton's annual conference that used to be in New York in September. And so instead of us taking the spot, we decided that we would have Pallavi Gaikwad get up and talk about her experience. That would be the best way for us to gain attention and to recognize the strides and the leadership and strength of young women. And she was the only young girl that had probably at that point ever spoken at CGI. And for her, it was a complete turning point in her career, and for NAS and their ability to get attention. So anyhow, can't understate that. Just publicly acknowledging and giving other people the platform to really shine is a great reward.
And you've hit on right there something that's kind of special, which is the reason I'm able to get not just some satisfaction out of having this show going and being able to share and bring people out is because when I started contacting people early on, they said, oh, we'll get you some speakers. There can never be too many of us. Hey, let me introduce you to somebody. And as opposed to, said, oh, I'll be on your show and I'll talk about me. They said, no, let me get you some people. And they just started sending lists. And that really is, a different way of helping out. They were, as they say, they were teaching me to fish. They weren't just throwing me a fish in that case. But I want to go back to, you talked about knowing what good looks like, because we all want to find, again, something to support, and then we want to start, how do we rate it, give it a number, much like, the results we want to show to our supporters. You talked about the right change in the right place, and it seems like you're asking, but why do you want to have girls play that sport? Why do you want to have women in college being able to compete at that level? It's not, well, because the boys are. That's not the answer. But I think that's the one that often is interpreted. And then, like you say, well, you've got uniforms, you've got a field. Isn't that good enough? It was we want them to play, to get the experience, and I think you're asking, why several times I've found. Have you had those discussions, in Title IX? Like, say, you've got a team, you've got access. Why would you want, what could you want more? Have you gotten into those deeper things about what it really means to a person to be a student athlete, to help them kind of understand what, where equality, other than saying there is a team, is needed?
Yeah. Well, I think there's two different pieces that you're talking about in the way I frame this in my mind. One is the discussion of girls' right to and access to play sport. So that is something that in this country, the Women's Sports Foundation has really in a lot of ways been leading on, and advocates like Donna Lopiano, who's one of she's one of my mentors and an absolute genius in this work, and has testified in so many court cases against universities and to make sure girls and women are getting an equal resources and participation. So there's that conversation. And then there's what happens when girls and women participate through sport. So once they get to the playing field, we know that in this country, there's longitudinal studies for over 40 years. There's the Acosta and Carpenter study that, gives us information about, when girls and women play sport, they are less likely to engage in risky behaviors. They are healthier. They're more likely to become women in C-suite positions. And so the case domestically in the U.S. has really been made to both parts of that. So why should girls get a fair shake? Because we have a law. Because we want to be more, gender equitable society, because, we have a long way to go. And then when they do play, what happens? But what we do at Women Win is not really focus on that, because that work is being done here and has been done by some fierce, fierce women. And men. There's a great researcher called Don Sabo who's done a lot of work on this, and another one named Michael Messner. And we think about this globally, because the rest of the world, with the exception of Australia and Europe, and mostly Northern Europe, doesn't really have any data for how many girls are playing. No policies for why there should be equality in sport, and very little data about what happens when girls do play, especially in those places of the world where girls are, this is the last frontiers, where they're least likely to play. So I last month spent 2.5 weeks in Pakistan. And Pakistan, of 144 countries that have been ranked in terms of their gender equality outcomes, in terms of maternal mortality, political representation of women, girls' education, you get the idea, they're 143 out of 144. So when a girl plays sport in that context, what does that mean for her when she actually breaks through? And it's a completely transformative experience. So, I guess there are lots of dimensions to this, and the drivers of why play are part of the roots of the questions of why we exist and what we work on every day in different contexts with different girls and different women.
Yeah, because I think that if more people are aware of what's being done again in these last frontiers, I think it will circle back to the first frontier, if you will, the one that I coach in, which is high school JV level, is the girls, some get it, which is I like it. I get a lot out of it. They show leadership. It's not because I want to, win something. It's really not. But sometimes it gets brought back to that much less mature level of, yes, we want these girls to be playing, competing fiercely in high school. Well, because the boys do. That's not the reason. And I think when I tell my players, said, yeah, sports really does a lot more. It turns not just girls into women, but into leaders. It has nothing to do with the sport. And they go, oh, which is why when they were saying, how do we vote on captains? Like, you don't vote on captains. I pick them based on where I see something special has nothing to do with the sport. That's why we're out here. And they, oh, I get it. But I think some of that is being lost locally. I think you're right that there's a lot of progress being made at the higher levels about the inclusion, but it's almost in some of the safest places, because where I live is nobody's at much of a threat of anything. But it's interesting how the power of sport is almost being forgotten, even locally here. And I think it's a good reminder to show them, what it's doing in some places, like say where you're heading, and they can still get those same benefits, just in your local hometown.
Sure. And, it's really, there's an irony here, because I think American youth sport is in jeopardy of extinction or of massive compromise. And, the pay-to-play models and if you look at access and who has access to sport in this country and who doesn't, look at a lot of the data specifically related to girls. But, if you are from a single-parent household, or if you're an immigrant, or if you are Latina or African American, if you live in a rural area instead of an urban area, the chances that you're going to access sport are really different than if that's not the case. And so I think I know the Aspen Institute has been doing, and Nike have been doing some work on thinking about reinventing youth sport in the United States, because, it was the World Cup, the men's FIFA soccer World Cup is about to start in, 2 days or something. I think they kick off. And the U.S. didn't even qualify. We got beaten by a small island country. And the conversation has been so interesting at U.S. soccer because, I think we don't have the grassroots players. And that pool is just a lot smaller than it used to be. So anyhow, I think a lot of those benefits that girls get, they're at risk of not getting, and boys as well, if we continue to narrow down and make our sport complex about building elite athletes. The sports specialization at an early age. I coach varsity soccer and have for years in Colorado, and just watching, girls no longer play 3 sports. If they play 2, it's usually one of the coaches is screaming about it, which leads to more injuries and earlier burnout, and can actually be quite problematic. So,
yeah, and that's kind of my point here, is that what can, earlier you were talking about who we're trying to help with this episode. And I said, well, a lot of domestic, practitioners, because the model you're, again, going to the last frontier to make some good things happen. If we're not careful, we're going to have these micro gaps, if you will, on a, it's a big deal, but you're going to have towns where the kids aren't getting anything out of sport. And you talk about the World Cup. It's not so much that we weren't good enough to get there. That's a reflection not of the skill, but of the kids not being attracted to play. We have such a huge pool of talented people in this country that it's just a matter of them wanting to do it and to love it while they're doing it. It has nothing to do with skills, and I think that's the key. It's not about winning. It's just the fact that it doesn't reflect our potential in terms of people getting loving to work hard at something is the key there. And I don't want people to think it's all about we got to be ranking because we're the U.S.
Yeah. And it blows me away that one of the wealthiest and the most populous countries on earth cannot, in the world's most popular game, cannot compete at the global level. It blew. Well, I'm also a soccer player and coach, so I have this soft spot here.
Well, and also now a lot of the most influential people to me on the show have been with soccer, because, and when I tell people in the lacrosse or baseball world, which are my main sports, that how sophisticated soccer is about